like to welcome everybody to WonderCon at Home 2021. This is the Riveting Reality and Illustrated Narrative panel. We have a stellar collection of contributors who use illustrated narrative to engage readers in the stories and ideas of politics, history, science, and more. We're going to spend some time exploring issues and storytelling dynamics with Rose Eveleth for Flash Forward, Nate Powell, Save It for Later, Tom Sullivan, Unsolved Case Files, Escape at 10,000 Feet, Manjit Thapp, Feelings, A Story in Seasons, Colleen AF Venable, Maker Comics, Build a Robot, and David Walker and Marcus Kwame Anderson, The Black Panther Party. I'm Maryelizabeth Yturralde of Creating Conversations here in Southern California, and I'm going to give you a little bit more of a bio of each of our contributors, starting with Rose. Rose is the producer and host of the hit podcast Flash Forward and was a producer of ESPN's award-winning 30 for 30 podcast. Her work has been featured in numerous publications, including The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, Scientific American, and the Best American Science Writing Anthology. Flash Forward will be on sale in April. Welcome, Rose. Nate Powell.
Thanks for having me. Sorry. I'm excited to be here. Sorry, I'll mute myself again.
Excitement is a good thing. Nate Powell is a National Book Award winning cartoonist whose work includes civil rights icon John Lewis's historic March trilogy. Sorry, we all miss the late John Lewis. Powell has also received the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, 3 Eisner Awards, the Michael L. Prince Award, the Comic-Con International Inkpot Award, 2 Ignatz Awards, and the Walter Dean Myers Award. He lives in Bloomington, Indiana. His latest work is Save It for Later, also on sale in April. Tom Sullivan is the author and illustrator of the picture books Out There, I Used to Be a Fish, and Blue versus Yellow. He resides with his family in Boston, Massachusetts, and you can visit him online at thomasgsullivan.com. Unsolved Case Files, Escape at 10,000 Feet was released in March. Manjit Thapp is an illustrator from the United Kingdom. She graduated with a BA in illustration from Camberwell College of Arts. Should I asked about pronunciation on that. Her illustrations combine traditional and digital media, and her work has been featured on Instagram, Dazed, Vogue India, and Wonderland magazine. She illustrated The Little Book of Feminist Saints, and her most recent book, Feelings, is also available in March. Colleen and Felicity Venable, which I love, I'm a fan of long names, is an author, designer, and maker. Her books include the young adult graphic novel Kiss No. 8, illustrated by Ellen T. Crenshaw, the quirky counting board book One More Wheel, illustrated by Blythe Russo, and the graphic novel series Guinea Pig, Pet Shop, Private Eye, illustrated by Stephanie Yu. Maker Comics, Build a Robot. Are we saying robot or robot?
I say robot, but that's just because I have some kind of city accent that's undefinable.
No worries. Comes out March 30th. And our co-creators, David F. Walker. David is an award-winning comic book writer, author, filmmaker, journalist, and educator. His work in comics includes Shaft, winner of the Glyph Award for Story of the Year, Power Man and Iron Fist, Nighthawk, Fury, Secret Wars, Battle World, Cyborg, The Army of Dr. Moreau, and Number 13. He's also the creator of the critically acclaimed young adult series, The Adventures of Darius Logan, and the author of the graphic novel biography, The Life of Frederick Douglass. Recognized as a leading scholar expert of African-American cinema, he produced one of the definitive documentaries on the topic of blaxploitation films, Macked, Hammered, Slaughtered, and Shafted. The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history, is out now. And his co-contributor is Marcus Kwame Anderson. Marcus is an illustrator and fine artist. Much of his work explores the beauty and diversity of the African diaspora and often incorporates social commentary. He graduated from SUNY Fredonia with a degree in illustration. He is the co-creator of the comic book series Snow Days and has illustrated stories in Action Lab's Cash and Carry and Force, F-O-R-C-E. So welcome all. I thought today, as we talk about our variety of topics, we have titles that range from DIY to history. We have titles that cover current events, future casting, and everything from the factual to the speculative, and the personal and emotional reactions to our world. So talking about story, I thought I'd ask each of you to talk about why this story and what it means to you, and maybe also touch on why you chose to tell it in this media. And because I'm a bookseller, I'm going to go alphabetical by last name and start with Rose.
Sure. So I make a podcast about the future. And so it was sort of a natural choice to then make a book about the future. But in fact, for years, people had been coming to me asking me to make a book based on the podcast, because that's like a good business decision, I suppose. And I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do because it didn't seem interesting to me to just like repackage the podcast transcripts or I don't know. I was like, would anyone buy that? Would I buy that? No, probably not. And so actually what happened was one of the illustrators who contributed one of the comics in the book, Sophie Goldstein, who's amazing, came to me and was like, I love the show. Have you ever thought of doing a comic version of the show? So the podcast has two parts. The first part is audio drama, kind of War of the Worldsy, like what's happening in this future. And the second part is all reporting and journalism. And it made complete sense once Sophie pitched it as using the comics in that same way, and being able to do something new that listeners hadn't ever seen before, hadn't heard before, and then kind of working with a bunch of artists. So the book is actually 12 different artists who contributed and worked with me on the comics, and then essays about the future that go with them based on the different topics. And when you report on the future, it's quite challenging because it has not happened yet. And so often there's nothing to show or there's nothing to sort of take people to see. And so the visuals were perfect because it was a great way to show people, here's what could happen in a really intimate way with characters that you relate to. And it was just sort of, it made complete sense once, it was all Sophie's idea. I can take no credit for the idea of doing it this way. And it was such a joy to work on. And I think it helped kind of lead people into the future in a really concrete way, as opposed to sort of abstract ideas about technology or science or culture. And so that's sort of how the book came to be, and why storytelling was the key piece of it.
Thank you. Nate, I know this tends to be sort of your wheelhouse, but do you want to talk a little bit about how you put together the new sort of collection of essays almost?
Sure. This comes from a little bit of a different approach for me in that it's a blend of memoir and essay. And I'm best known for making nonfiction comics, but I'm not really a nonfiction comics person. My home planet is really making weird kind of romantic existential fiction tinged with, genre. But I'd say late in 2017, early in 2018, having two young kids, and being part of a family unit that is adjusting very rapidly, like everyone else, with living through and reacting to a very serious authoritarian power grab, and watching a very, very quick series of changes being pushed forward in the United States. A lot of time went into sort of being mindful of where that met up with my own small kids' worldviews and trying to explain very complicated things at their level in a way that they could actually do something with at their level. So a lot of that simply had to do with adjusting, 4 to 8-year-olds with the long-term reality of participating civically, but also participating in protest, the way that intertwines with everything that occurred in 2020 and sort of the turning of societal norms and the ways we spend space and time. Everything sort of inverted and thrown out the window, adjusting to that in real time. So for the most part, I feel like so much has gone on in the last 5 years that I think there's a very broadly shared implicit feeling that there's not enough bandwidth for people to air more subjective, more personal, more emotional accounts and responses, experiences over the last 5 years, as we in our private lives have been adjusting to a lot of the pushback and pushing back to the pushback that's happening on a social and political level. And so a lot of it was like on a personal tip, I had my sketchbook and I wanted to get a lot of these family interactions and ways of explaining things to my kids down, because I noticed that people weren't really airing a lot of this stuff in a public sense on social media. And I felt like the private and subjective side of what the United States has been through was sort of falling through the cracks. At the same time, I was doing some short comic essays that were really kind of chopping up decades worth of the advancement and normalization of a lot of paramilitary and fascist symbols and aesthetic, and sort of bringing them into pop culture, which have brought us to this moment. And so at a certain point, I realized that what I was doing in my sketchbook and the essay work that I feel like I needed to be published in some way had a home together. And so the book sort of bounces back and forth between subjective and objective accounts of the changing state of our nation over the past decade.
Fantastic, thank you. I think I saw a lot of nodding. I think a lot of us are feeling similar things. So Tom, to look sort of in a different direction, what appealed to you about your work other than the fact that we're in the 21st century and yet there's still some unknown mysteries?
Yeah, so I'm sure like a lot of you, like true crime is just such a cool genre and something that like I've always loved, like as long as I can remember, from watching just like Unsolved Mysteries or 48 Hours on TV and reading all these stories. But anyway, like, so, coming from picture books, I was looking to make the leap to a longer book and just didn't really know where to go. And then just started thinking about true crime and working that into a children's story. So with that said, keeping away from grisly true crimes. And one of what I thought was like the coolest stories out there is D.B. Cooper, who, if you're not familiar, was just this guy, very dapper, went into an airport in Portland, Oregon, bought a one-way ticket to Seattle, and then hijacked the plane with a bomb, asking a ransom. And then he gets this 200 grand and then jumps out of the plane and disappears forever. And it's just such like a Hollywood style story that I just wanted to tell. But at the same time, I didn't want to just kind of do a recreation of the events and kind of make up fake dialogue. So there's no dialogue in this book, and it's almost written like excerpts from an FBI file. So the font is all typewriter, and it's looked like it's cut and paste, and I could show there's documents and all kinds of stuff inside here. There we go. Yeah, like cut up pieces of paper, and the whole book is framed around the idea of a case file. So you're looking through this file, and one page you're seeing these reenactments of what's happening, and then the next you're seeing plane tickets and diagrams and maps and all kinds of just evidence, I guess. So that's what was drawn to me. I was looking for just something a little different, and kind of just took that idea and ran with it. And now I'm lucky and fortunate enough to have a series. So I'm working on the second installment as we speak.
And can you share what?
Oh yeah, the second one is about Alcatraz. The three, Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, escaping from Alcatraz. And there will be a third one after that about an art heist that happened here in Boston. And we'll have to see if there's any more after that.
Very cool. We'll see what the the audience is at that age.
Yeah.
All right, Manjit, I have a question about feelings, which is, I love the fact that you told the story in seasons, but does it feel different to have chosen seasons to tell the story when we're living through the pandemic and a lot of us are not as connected to them?
Yeah, I mean, I was definitely thinking about that a lot lately, about how if I was writing the book this year, how different it would have been, because I feel the same. I don't feel as connected to the seasons anymore, and especially going outside here in the UK where we're in a lockdown now. So I feel like it would be totally different. But yeah, when I first started making the book, I really wanted to just focus on the sort of everyday female experience and kind of the multiple facets that we have in our minds, and looking at those kind of internal feelings that lie just beneath the surface that we don't kind of tend to talk about. So the book kind of follows the journey of one woman's year of emotions, and each chapter is a different season. So you go from the high emotions and kind of the productivity, the creativity that you'd feel in the high of summer, to kind of the loneliness that you'd feel in winter. Yeah.
And I have to say, as a words person, I appreciated the portions in which you deliberately used synonyms. You know, you talk about springing into things or falling through things when you're not necessarily talking about the seasons. And I was like, I see what she did there.
Yeah, I think this was like the first book that I kind of authored. So I think I find it quite difficult to talk about my feelings, but kind of making those comparisons to the weather and to the seasons changing felt a little bit easier. So I'm glad that you noticed that.
Fabulous. Thank you. Colleen, so you had an interesting task because you have a DIY book, but you need to put a story in it.
I mean, I actually didn't need to put a story in it. I wanted to put a story in it. A lot of the maker comics are very much like, they'll have some characters, but they'll walk you through projects. But I loved the idea of it being like, first of all, it's Toaster 2 is this sentient toaster that's secretly a robot. T2, we call him, obviously, robots. And he's talking directly to the reader like a choose your own adventure book and giving you projects to do. And each project is getting closer for you to get out of the house so he could take over the world. But you have to defeat all your siblings and you have to defeat your parents. And then the big boss is the cat, which, thank you, Nate, for having an example in the background. I'm like, trying not to watch your cat. I was like, that's who really draws the books, isn't it? The big boss is the cat, and that's when you have to do the more complicated things. And I wrote this book for two reasons. One, I was looking at robotics books as I was learning more about robotics, and especially books for kids. They were either like, glue googly eyes to a cardboard tube, you have a robot. Or they were like, okay, now start with your like Arduino Uno. And it's like, what? Like there was not any kind of like build-up. And I wanted something that was started small and got you up to actual coding. But every single project is kind of cool. So even ones like you make a cardboard spider that you have little hydraulic like plungers that you could like move the legs like this. Like it's a pretty simple little robot, but it also teaches you about, you know, hydraulics and teaches you about like all this stuff. And the second reason I really wanted to do this book was I work in a makerspace in Brooklyn. It's actually the very first makerspace in New York City. So it was the second in the entire country. And makerspaces traditionally are almost all male and almost all white male. And our makerspace has done a really good job with gender diversity. We still have a ways to go in a lot of other ways, but we actually got invited to the White House, not recently, this was the last year of Obama, to talk about how we were able to get so many female identified members, because we're officially 45 members and 51% of us are female identified. And we went there and it talked a lot about classes that I was teaching, which made me feel really good because I never thought of myself as a tech person until I slowly started to learn. So I would do these like stealth classes being like, okay, it's a nail art class. But when they'd get there, I'd be like, okay, now we're going to use a laser to nail art, like etch some stencils, or here's a diorama class. Now we're going to use Dremels to hollow out an egg, and like teaching people never thought they could use them. So for me, it was really important that actually the entire team on Maker Comics Robots was all women, including our vetters, including like the people that tested the robots, the designer, the editors. And it's just really nice to know that there's this book that is hopefully going to empower other girls to like want to join this really exploding field. And for me, it's just fun. Like, I don't make robots for a living, but like, oh my gosh, it's so much fun to make like a little car that goes wee wee when it gets too close to your cat.
Fantastic, thank you. I think we lost you for a second. You had a freeze in your audio, but all the enthusiasm and joy came through anyway. David and Marcus, you want to talk about the very timely Black Panther Party graphic novel history and what drew you to the story?
Sure, but first, I just want to say that like how great it is to be part of this panel. And like I believe this is the future of this medium and this industry that we've all embraced, nonfiction, and so it's like I did a proposal last year for a book about D.B. Cooper that got rejected, and I have a collection of both essays and comic strips that I was like, I don't know what to do with this, and now I'm like, oh well, if Powell did it, I'll just wait for his to come out and then I can just copy it, right? So I just like, seriously, I part of me just wants to shut up and listen to what everyone else is saying. The Black Panther Party book came, it was on the heels of a book that I'd written about the life of Frederick Douglass, and my editor at 10 Speed Press had, we were talking about what would be next. And I had mentioned a desire to do specifically a book about the life and the murder of Fred Hampton, who was the head of the Illinois Black Panther Party. And my editor at the time, to his credit, said that he felt that that people didn't know enough about the Black Panthers in general for that book to fully resonate. And while I didn't agree 100% with him, I thought, okay, there is some validity to this. And since then, this film about Fred Hampton has come out. So I feel like it was a really good choice on our part, because then the comparisons would have been too much. I first discovered who the Black Panther Party, well, let me go back. I discovered who Fred Hampton was when I was about 19 or 20 years old. But Fred Hampton was murdered 4 days after I turned 1 year old. And I felt like, how did I go my entire life not knowing who Fred Hampton was, not knowing, anything about the Black Panther Party? And so that set me on a path in my late teens and early 20s, studying about this organization and about this one particular individual, and a certain amount of obsession. And so when the opportunity came to do a nonfiction graphic novel about them, I jumped on it, and really because I felt like no kid in America, especially in the state of Utah, should not know who the Black Panther Party is. And I wanted to write something that would be easily accessible, because I feel like a lot of history texts outside of what we get when we're, say, in elementary school or high school, a lot of history texts, especially at the high school and even college level, they're just too dense and too dry. And honestly, if a book doesn't have pictures in it, there's a good chance it's not a good book. And I don't care what it is, even my copy of the Bible is illustrated. So I just feel like there's as educators and as creators, we don't utilize how people learn and how they're engaged most. And the truth of the matter is that the combination of words and pictures is how the vast majority of us learn how to read. And it's actually the reason why so many young people lose interest in reading, is when the pictures are removed from the books. So that kind of encapsulates both the Black Panthers and my philosophy about this medium of we could call it graphic narrative. It's and that's the thing, it's changing so quickly, right? It's and then I knew I wanted to work with an amazing artist, and so Marcus was the guy.
Marcus, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, definitely. First of all, honored to be on the panel, and I was honored, when David reached out. Initially, I didn't even know what because it was very early on, so I didn't know what the project was. But I just know that he wanted to, submit samples of my work to the publisher. And then it was when I was at the very tail end, working on the final page of my previous graphic novel, Cash and Carry, that David called me with the good news. And when I heard it was about the Black Panther Party, I was, immediately like just beyond excited, because I was coming into the project with a good amount of knowledge about the Panthers, and I 100% feel that their story is one that needs to be more widely known. Even right now with we spoke about Fred Hampton. He was when it came to the FBI's counterintelligence program, targeting Black leaders who they feared could become a Black messiah that could unite people beyond Black people. Fred Hampton was one of those names. I was right up there with Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, but like he's not as widely known. So like David said, it's a history that needs to be known. And a lot of my work in general, even just my paintings, deal with figures throughout civil rights history and history period. So, and I love comics. So it was just it was a perfect merging of my two interests. And yeah, I was just 100% ready for this project. I felt like it was the project I was waiting for without knowing that I was waiting for it.
I like that descriptive. So my follow-up question is going to cover a little bit of territory that you all covered in your first answers, but just to sort of expand, which is, you talked about what inspired and drew you to the story. So for the reader who picks it up, what do you want them to take away? What do you hope to be conveying now that the work is completed? And I'm going to go ahead and go back in the same order, starting with Rose.
Sure. I mean, I cover the future, which is both exciting, I think, for lots of people, but also really scary a lot of the time. It, especially now, feels very uncertain, right? It's unclear what's going to happen. I talk to a lot of people who try not to think about the future very much because it's actually like out of your control, or feels like you don't have a say because powerful corporations and politicians don't have your best interests in mind, and they're just making decisions, and what are you going to do about it? And so the big sort of ethos of both the podcast and the book, hopefully, that comes through is this idea that, yes, you're not a mega millionaire probably reading it, I would imagine, or the president or whatever it is, but you actually can shape the future in really important ways, and that the future hasn't happened yet, and it's not inevitable, that there are things that we can all do, and that a lot of those things aren't really like high tech. They're like getting involved in your local activist group. They're like fighting for the things you care about, and kind of showing people through these stories how they can get involved, how they can kind of take the thing in the future that they want and make it happen. The motto of the show is imagine better futures. And so, it's one of those things where once you can imagine what you want or what you don't want, there's a function in imagining dystopia as well, right? Like, let's not go down this road. We see where it leads and we should go this direction instead. But hopefully by the end of the book, folks will have a sense that the future is in fact something that they have a say in, and that it's not just like white guys in black turtlenecks on TED Talk stages who determine the future. It is in fact anybody who's reading the book, but also sort of a couple of tools and ways of thinking about the future. There's a concept in psychology called mental time travel, which is basically just imagining the future. It's just a cool way of saying imagining the future. And research shows, in fact, that people who do this, people who practice this, are happier. They're healthier. People who are depressed have a really hard time doing this because it's just like, well, it's going to be the same, and I know I felt that. I'm sure a lot of folks here have felt that. And if you can practice even just imagining what tomorrow might be like, let alone 10 years from now, whatever, you can actually feel like you have more control and more power and more ability to shape that future. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping these stories and these pieces help people imagine and understand, is that, probably you can't snap your fingers and solve inequality tomorrow, but you can do these smaller things that'll get us there and get involved and get activated in ways that do change the future. So that's kind of the hope, fingers crossed, that people go away with from the book.
Thank you. Nate, that's actually seems like a really nice segue into yours.
Yes, I agree. Coming from a very similar place, I guess the most basic takeaways simply have to do with really how, especially viewed through the lens of spending 5 years working on the March trilogy to tell the history of the civil rights movement through the eyes and in the voice of someone who is at the center of the young people's wing within the movement, and also viewed through the lens of not just the intergenerational conflict and changing of the guard within the movement, but intergenerational reckonings between Generation X and the baby boomers who raised us, and the Generation Z little ones who I'm bringing up, but finding more similarities in terms of social perspective between a lot of boomers and Generation Xers than differences. And I don't mean that in the best way. I think one of the most important takeaways is has to do with these erroneous assumptions of the inevitability of progress. And I think that's something that people raised in the 70s and 80s by boomer parents often, particularly with white middle-class Americans and families raised with basically a story of progress that has no beginning and no end. It's simply a footnote in itself. And so there are always assumptions of the wheels of progress propelling on their own. It was encouraging to see people sort of get fired up again with a general overarching sense of civic engagement, and which sort of forced a level of trust with strangers, redefining in a good way these concepts of the relationships we have with our neighbors. And these things were also turned on their head again as the pandemic hit, as our social interactions were sort of flipped and inverted. But I'd say, yeah, in terms of this intergenerational reckoning, it also, like another takeaway is, it's important the older you get, especially as a parent, especially if you consider yourself to be, everybody thinks they're cool, everybody thinks they're down, everybody thinks they've got the right ideas. But one of the most important things for me is that, it's already started with my older kid, but at a certain point, your kids or the younger generation are going to call you out for being the dinosaur, for having old-fashioned, messed up ideas that you're not aware have fallen behind the scope and scale and direction of human progress and social progress. And it's just important to listen to those voices because they're usually right. And so it's kind of nice. Like I'm only 42 now, but I can really feel that it's becoming my turn to shut up a little more and hand the wheels over. I mean, even to like my 9-year-old, the fact that like kids get it on their level and they absorb and process so much more than we give them credit for. So a lot of this really is about equipping young people with the tools they need at their level to process what has been happening in the US and beyond, but also being able to do something with it at their level.
Thank you. Actually, I confess, as someone recognizing a bit of my own being a dinosaur, I do also have to say, Tom, when I read your book, you talk about D.B. Cooper being dapper, but let's face it, he was also white. Would this necessarily have been a story that happened if he hadn't been in that position of privilege? And do you anticipate having some of those conversations with your audience, even though it is a younger audience?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and one that I honestly didn't even really think about. But yeah, back in 1971, a white man in a business suit was pretty much untouchable. So yeah, had it been a person of color, like maybe he would have been flagged. I mean, he didn't even need identification to buy a ticket. Like that's just how crazy air travel was in general back then. And part of the book, I go into the state of hijacking. I forget the exact number, but there was something like 68 hijackings in like a 2-year span or something, you know, just crazy. And it really, that case really did change airport security in general. Yeah, you know, I think what I would like kids to take from this story and the rest of the series in general is that these cases are theoretically solvable. And D.B. Cooper is a treasure hunt. So the case was cold and it happened in 1971. In 1980, an 8-year-old kid found $5,800 just buried in the sand. So there is 194,000 and change still sitting out there in the Pacific Northwest. And, you know, same with Alcatraz, it's chump change compared, but I think there's a $15,000 reward if you can find these guys. And with the art heist in Boston, that's $5 million if you can find those paintings. So there's serious rewards out there if you could solve these cases.
Time to break out the Scooby Gang.
Yeah, exactly.
To go to sort of the journal reference. So, Manjit, what about what you would like readers to take away from your work?
I think mine's quite simple. I think I just kind of want, hopefully, people to find that they're able to relate to it and kind of feel connected and comforted, because hopefully these are feelings that I think a lot of people feel. And one of the themes in the book is seasonal affective disorder, which is something that I don't really hear a lot about. So hopefully I've been able to draw light on that as well. But yeah, just something that people can feel connected to and feel comforted by, I guess.
I think all of us can identify, even if we're not artistic ourselves, with the idea of, you know, a less colorful world in our perceptions or in reality, or a more colorful one.
Yeah.
Colleen, what would you like people to take away from making robots other than don't trust T2?
I think it's mostly just how many times you're going to mess up in anything you do. It's going to be 1,000 mess ups until you finally figure something out. And one of my favorite things I did in the book was talk about some inventions in the past that led to like advances in robotics. And I have a whole section about glue. And you don't think about that as being a big thing, but like every maker I know, we start with hot glue. Like this is like the greatest tool for it's not like fancy gears, it's not this, it's something very simple and something that you use as a kid all the time. And to try to take these things and be like, it's just a project. Like if you take away in your mind that you are building some electronic thing, it's not hard. Soldering is actually really easy. Like there are things that people I think have a resistance to. And in the back of the book, I talk about places in the community that you can go to find places to, there's all these maker spaces, especially in cities, that are open to the public. I talk about how to start your own robotics club at your school and how to advocate for your school to get the supplies you need. Because in the book itself, I wanted every single thing that was made, with the exception of the very last project, are things that you could take apart in your house. Parents may not like that, and make, because I grew up without money. And if I wanted to learn robotics, I took apart something in the house. You know, it wasn't like these fancy kits that you buy that are $200 for a couple of things that make something light up. You know, it's more about like the people that started all of this, they started it by playing. And that's what I want kids to get from this book, is that playing is fun and learning is fun, and just exploring the world can be very fun.
Thank you. All right, David and Marcus. I mean, I'm guessing it's just, you know, like David said, better accessibility to part of American history by giving us history with pictures, but please.
Oh no, there's so much more, trust me. So when Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale founded the Black Panther Party in 1966, they started by putting together a manifesto, their 10-point program. It was broken down into 2 sections, 10 points of what we want, 10 points of what we need, with the exception of one of those points, which was they wanted exemption of all Black men from the military and the draft, because the draft was going on during the Vietnam War. 9 out of those 10 points that they were addressing are still relevant today, like, and not like vastly, it's like exactly the same. It was an end to police brutality. It was an end to trials of juries without your peers. It was an end to poverty. Every kid in America who is in a public school system who is meets a certain threshold, their family meets a certain threshold of what's defined as poverty, gets free breakfast. The Panthers started that. The thing that we need to know, going back to the Black Lives Matter protest over the summer of 2020, over the killing of George Floyd, that was predicted by the federal government in 1968 with the Kerner Commission report. They said this is exactly what's going to happen. The book that Marcus and I put together is a book that, with its primary focus, is 55 to 50 years ago. But everything that's happening today in this country was happening then. And everything that was done to stop the Panthers, to stop people from trying to assert their rights as human beings, is still being done. So in its own way, this book is a blueprint for these are the things that you can do. These are the things that will be done to stop you. How do you figure a way around it? And I got to be honest, I hate the fact that this book is so relevant right now. I wish it could be something that people would look back and go, man, it's so bad that times were so, difficult 55 years ago, 56 years ago. But, we've every single thing that this country was facing in 1966, 1967, we're facing now. And for people who wonder how we got there or how we got where we are today, like, I feel like our book is a good jumping off point, because it also tells you, okay, you also need to go back in history another 40 years, another 100 years, another 200 years. Here are some of the key things that you need to know. So, I get really passionate about it, because what everybody's talking about is really, what are different ways to educate young people, right? We, especially my generation, we're taught in this very narrow way, and learning is defined in this very narrow way. And what we now know is that there's multiple ways that people can learn. Some people aren't as good at reading. Some people aren't as good with tactile learning. There's some people who are never going to quite be able to get robotics, right? But then there's other people who, if you talk to them in terms of seasons and colors, they're going to understand that in ways. And that's what's, exciting about not just this panel but also where, again, this medium that we're all working in is headed. So I just want people to know that our book isn't about the past. It's about right now.
Yeah. And also, like, Nate was speaking about, the idea of progress and, from generation to generation. I firmly believe that we, in every generation, need to be trying to leave the world in a better place than, when we found it. And I agree with everything that David just said. And at the start of the book, we cover the history, the long history of the United States. We try to encapsulate it, but a lot of the brutality and the just iniquity that necessitated the civil rights movement and groups like the Panthers. And that fire has continued, the fire to want to change things that are unjust, that we're faced with in this current generation. We've spoken about the Black Lives Matter movement, and obviously I hope the proceeding generations will continue. But I firmly believe that when things aren't right, we do need people to be courageous and face that, even against insurmountable odds. And we spoke about the things that happened to, like, Fred Hampton and some of the leaders. And when I think about the incredible courage, these guys were oftentimes in their early to mid 20s, and they just knew that things weren't right, and they knew that they had to do what they thought was best in the time. And there were mistakes made, and there were a lot of things done right. And each generation of activists, builds on the one that came before. And so I think the cool thing about our book is we speak about the things that worked, we speak about the things that didn't, we speak about the forces that opposed progress and still do oppose progress. So I think even that can be a tool for current generations and future generations as they stand up, just for humanity and for those common human rights that were detailed in the 10-point program.
Yeah, I mean, in reading it, as distressing as some of the sort of active things were, lynchings, other suppression, some of the other distressing stuff was sort of the complacency or the disregard to see, to sort of touch on what Nate had mentioned, to see the sort of, lack of response to investigations into situations saying, these are the root causes that could be addressed. We could address education. We could address, segregated living situations. We could do things that can help move us forward as a country. But maybe we're getting more to a place like Rose was talking about, where collectively we're able to look to the future. Hopefully, if we can get out of our sort of, I guess, seventh season, maybe you'd call it right now. I don't quite know what to call, living in quarantine in the pandemic. It doesn't feel like it fits into sort of anything that we know. Maybe the monsoon season felt closest, but to move forward. So we're getting close to the end of our time. Did anybody have any final thoughts they wanted to share?
I did, but my mental train just went off the track, and it was going to tie everything together, all of our work. So let me think about it for a second. Somebody else come up with something profound, and that'll jog me.
I always like to hear what everybody's reading. If they're reading other books, they're great. If you haven't read any of the Nathan Hale books, this one just came out. It's A Tale of Haiti, Napoleon, and the Louisiana Purchase. They're graphic novels. They are both hysterical and the history events. I never understood so many things. Like, I never understood World War I, and I realized this until I read the book. And then, not this, but one of his others. They're just so good. And this has been something that I've been able to give to a lot of, not just like kids, but adults. And they loved it, and they learned about something that they don't normally find out about. Like, a lot of people don't know about the whole thing that happened with Napoleon in Haiti.
I remember what I was going to say. We live in a time where the Mars rover is projecting images back to Earth of what's going on Mars, which speaks to the incredible accomplishments that are capable. This is what Rose is talking about, and this is what Colleen's talking about. And at the same time, we can't do anything about poverty. We can't do anything about racial inequity, about sexism, about homophobia, transphobia. And so, the past, we have to learn from the past in order for our future to be the best thing that it can possibly be. We have to learn, as Nate's talking about with his new book, about the difference between objective and subjective. And if you can't remember, you write a little note and you put it, next to your computer, like I've got, and learn the importance of being both objective and subjective, sometimes in the exact same moment. And there's so much to be learned. And it's again, I'm geeking out over all these books that are coming out and the possibilities, and really thinking, I just want to say this, that, I was thinking how, I don't know if I'm going to go back to conventions once the pandemic's over, but this makes me want to go back to conventions. This makes, I'm like, I want to be sitting at the same table with all of you. And I haven't given up hope for anything, both a world in a post-pandemic world, but also, a world where, like, we can actually walk on Mars, and where we can end poverty and where we can end racism and sexism. I mean, if I gave up on that, that would mean I'm giving up on everything. So thank you everybody for sort of, I woke up kind of grumpy this morning, and thank you, Tom, for proving that DB Cooper is a great idea, and it was just nobody was listening to me.
Yeah, I just want to say that it's really been a pleasure to be on the panel. I'm basically adding everybody's work to my reading list to purchase in the future, because these all sound like really cool projects. And yeah, I 100% agree with David's sentiments about nonfiction. It's funny, since the Black Panther book has come out, the biggest honor for me personally has been just the amount of teachers who have, said that they were going to use our book in the classroom. And that is more fulfilling. Like, because I was a kid, I grew up reading Spider-Man, X-Men and everything. And of course, if you asked me when I was 9 or 10, I would tell you that's what I wanted to grow up to do. But I feel like there is something really fulfilling about knowing that, that the future generation, in some small part, we're going to play a role in their experience, in their education. So, I mean, I think it's pretty powerful. And yeah, and also a lot of people have been saying like, oh, I'd love to see an Ida B. Wells book or this, and I'm like, yeah, we should. And I mean, I have to stop. I know David's busy, so I try not to just hit him up all the time and be like, hey, let's make an Ida B. Wells book. But I just feel like there's so much potential in nonfiction, and it's beautiful.
Well, thank you all once again for sharing your books, for sharing recommendations of other people's books, and for taking time out of your day to spend having this conversation. And I deeply appreciate it. And I think that this was a wonderful way to try to have a WonderCon panel, even if we couldn't all be in Anaheim together. And like David, I do look forward, a little trepidatiously, but I do look forward to gathering in person again. At the same time, it's kind of nice to be able to have an international panel without people necessarily having to face travel. So thank you all so much. And I'm going to call that the end.